It began with a body, or rather what was left of one. On a humid July morning in 2001, deep in the mountainous terrain of Henan province, China hikers stumbled across something they would never forget: a woman's body lying at the base of a narrow gorge in the Tung Sun Range. The corpse was badly decomposed, clothes, tattered skin marred by time and exposure. But what disturbed the local police wasn't just the condition, it was what remained intact. A wedding ring engraved with the names Wu and Chan, a gold necklace shaped like a heart, and a high-end wristwatch still clinging to her left arm. It was clear this wasn't an accident. The bruises, the broken bones, signs of trauma too deliberate to be the result of a simple fall. Investigators quickly ruled out misadventure. This was something else. Word of the discovery spread like wildfire across Henan, and it didn't take long before one man showed up at the station, pale and shaking. His name was Chu Vian-o, and he believed that the woman found was his wife, Nam Tiu Chan, who had vanished nearly 2 months earlier. But if this really was her, what happened in those missing weeks? And more importantly, why was she found here alone, broken and discarded at the bottom of a ravine?
At first, everyone thought it was just a tragic case of a woman who met the wrong person at the wrong time. But what no one could have known was this: her death would unlock a chain of horrors buried deep in the woods of Mount Song, and her killer wasn't finished yet.
It started like any ordinary morning. May 2nd, 1996. Nam Tiu Chan, a 34-year-old businesswoman and director of a medical equipment firm in Henan, left her home around 6:30 a.m. Her husband, Chu Vian-ao, a freelance architect, stayed behind sipping tea, in silence, neither of them knowing it would be the last morning they'd share. She looked composed, calm, no visible signs of distress. She kissed him goodbye like always. But by nightfall, she still hadn't come home. At first, Chu wasn't worried. He called once. No answer. Then again, still nothing. Eventually, the calls stopped ringing altogether.
It wasn't like her. She was ambitious, yes, but never careless, never disconnected.
By the next morning, Chu Vian-ao was at the police station, visibly anxious, reporting his wife missing. He told officers that she hadn't returned, hadn't called, and no one, not her family, not her co-workers, had heard from her. The police, bound by protocol, advised patience. After all, it hadn't even been 48 hours. Adults have the right to disappear, to take a break, to step away, to vanish for a while. But Chu insisted she wouldn't do that. She wouldn't leave her company. She wouldn't leave me. Still, the police asked him to go home and wait. He didn't. Instead, he scoured the streets, called everyone in her life, checked hospitals, morgues. Nothing.
The next day, May 4th, with no word from Nam Tiu Chan, the case was officially opened.
That's when strange details started to emerge. When investigators visited her workplace, colleagues said Tiu Chan had called in that morning. She told them she had personal errands and wouldn't be coming in an unusual move for someone as dedicated as her. Even more strange, she told her husband she was going to the office as usual. Why lie? Had she meant to meet someone? Was she keeping secrets? Police then questioned her husband's potential involvement. After all, in cases like this, the spouse is always the first place to look. Neighbors painted a complicated picture. To the outside world, the couple looked loving. But according to people living nearby, the days leading up to her disappearance were filled with shouting. One neighbor recalled hearing the crash of glass-raised voices and furniture being overturned. They were worried enough to knock on the door. No one answered.
A domestic dispute, possibly. A motive, maybe.
But when officers pressed Chu Vian-ao, he denied any fight. He was cooperative, calm, offered full access to his home and phone records. He even volunteered a timeline. That morning, after his wife left his co-worker, a man named Chao Tun V arrived to pick him up for a job. V, too, confirmed the story. He even remembered seeing Tiu Chan driving off in her car. The two men worked side by side all day. Their alibis checked out. Then came a twist. Roughly a week into the investigation, another body was discovered, this one under a bridge not far from Chu's house. The police were hopeful. Could this be her? They called in the family for identification. Her sister Nam An Tuyet took one look and burst into tears. "It's her," she whispered. But Chu Vian-ao shook his head. That's not my wife. Two people closest to her. Two opposite reactions. Police began to suspect Chu was denying the truth, maybe even hiding something. But the DNA test told a different story. The woman under the bridge wasn't Nam Tiu Chan. Back to square one. As days turned into weeks, posters of Tiu Chan's face flooded Henan's streets. Family members begged for tips. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it became a regional mystery. Then, nearly 2 months later, the call came and a decomposed female body had been found deep in the Tung Sun mountain range. Wedding ring, watch, heart-shaped necklace, all matched. When Chu saw the items, he broke down. That's her, he whispered. DNA would later confirm it. It was Nam Tiu Chan. And just like that, a missing person case turned into a homicide. But something still didn't add up. Why was she in the mountains miles from home? And how did no one see her for nearly 2 months? Little did they know, this case had just cracked open something far more terrifying. After the discovery of Nam Tiu Chan's remains, something shifted. The quiet mountains of Tung Son no longer felt serene. Something darker seemed to stir in the silence. The autopsy report was grim. Tiu Chan had suffered multiple fractures. Her clothing was torn in ways that suggested violent struggle. The position of the body and the extent of internal injuries made one thing clear: she hadn't simply fallen. She'd been pushed, hard, and whoever did it had made sure she wouldn't be found, at least not for a long time. Investigators believed it was a one-off tragedy, a cruel crime perhaps committed by someone passing through. But just as they began to close the case, another woman vanished. Her name was Lu Tin, a 22-year-old tourist from the province of Habak. On June 13, 1997, just a year after Tiu Chan's death, she traveled with a tour group to Mount Song. At around 12:15 p.m., she left the group to explore a quiet trail behind the famous Tu Lam Temple. She never came back. 5 days later, her body was found near a remote stream hidden by thick underbrush, naked, hands tied behind her back, mouth sealed with duct tape. The brutality mirrored Tiu Chan's case. Different victims, same mountain, same horror. Police widened their search, combing through past reports. That's when a disturbing pattern emerged. Just a few weeks earlier, on May 10th, a 13-year-old schoolgirl named H. Lin Lin had gone missing from a village at the foot of the mountain. She was walking home alone from school. Her body was found 2 weeks later in a wheat field. Bound, assaulted, lifeless. She had died in the same brutal way. And it didn't stop there. On September 13th, yet another girl, 13-year-old Diu Hui An, was found in a roadside ditch. She, too, had vanished while walking alone, and she, too, had been a classmate of Lin Lin. 3 victims, 3 different ages, 3 different backgrounds, but the same modus operandi. A predator was on the loose, and he had a hunting ground. The Tung Sun region, once known for temples, serenity, and pilgrimage, was now a place of whispers and fear. Women stopped hiking alone. Parents clung tighter to their daughters. Locals spoke in hushed tones about a monster in the mountains. Police, meanwhile, were overwhelmed. They had no suspect, no concrete leads, no surviving witnesses. Between 1996 and 2001, 7 women would lose their lives in this fashion. The youngest victim was just 11 years old. The oldest, a woman in her 50s. All of them vanished in or near the Tung Sun area. All of them assaulted. All of them killed. And not one lead pointed to a culprit. It felt almost supernaturally like someone was watching. Someone who knew the mountains better than the police did. Someone who knew how to hide and when to strike. In 2001, a new officer took over the investigation. Her name was Nam Truong Ha, a respected law enforcement figure known for her relentless tenacity. The moment she saw the files, she realized this wasn't just a murder spree. This was a serial predator, and the mountain was his domain. She created a new task force, brought in undercover officers, analysts, pattern experts. They studied every inch of the terrain, reviewed all old cases, and tried to predict his next move. And then, nothing. For 2 months, the mountain went silent. No new attacks, no new victims, no trace of the killer. But silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's just the deep breath before the next scream. For months, the task force combed through every detail of the attacks near Tung Sun. They deployed drones, sniffer dogs, and undercover officers disguised as solo hikers, temple visitors, even pilgrims. But it was like chasing a ghost. One investigator said, "It felt like the mountain was watching us, like it knew we were coming."
Then, on July 23, 2001, a break.
A local woman named Can Bin, who worked at the Tu Lam Temple's visitor center, had agreed to give a ride on her motorized tricycle to a man dressed in Buddhist monk robes. He was in his 40s, calm and softly spoken. He asked to be dropped off 3 kilometers from Lien Hoa Temple, saying he needed to hike the rest of the way on foot. It was nearly 7 p.m. The sun was low. Most tourists had already left. Bin didn't think much of it, until the monk suddenly stopped mid-trail, turned around and lunged. He grabbed her by the neck, dragged her into the trees, and tied her hands behind her back with rope. He reached for duct tape, but before he could silence her, Ben made a last-ditch move. She begged. "I'll do what you want," she whispered. "Just don't kill me." That hesitation saved her life. After assaulting her, the attacker fled into the woods, disappearing as quickly as he came. Being bruised but alive, stumbled back down the mountain and reported everything to the police: the route, the details, the face. Her description was chillingly precise. The team focused their search on temples and hermitages near the trail. That's when they heard the name Vuong Tu Fong. Temple residents said he wasn't a real monk. No background, no ID. He had once begged to stay at the temple as a wandering ascetic, but after being caught stealing from the donation box, he was kicked out.
No one had seen him in weeks.
A monk from Ngok Huang Temple farther up the mountain recalled another man, same build, same face, who came through often claiming he was a Taoist herbalist looking for wild roots. They called him eccentric, odd but harmless. Now he was their prime suspect. Officers quickly locked down the mountainside. They set up roadblocks at every trail exit, sealed off hiking paths, and deployed plainclothes officers throughout the local temples. By July 24th, they found him. Vuong Tu Fong, real name Vuong Jong Fong, was arrested while trying to slip through a trail behind the Tu Lam complex. At first, he said nothing. Didn't resist. Didn't speak. Back at the station, he sat with arms crossed and eyes cold. Even under questioning, he refused to answer. But at night, other inmates reported something disturbing. He would scream about women, about hate, about being betrayed by everyone, men and women alike. Officers began to realize this wasn't just a fugitive. This was someone fractured. One investigator, Officer Tu Hao, changed tactics. He stopped asking questions. Instead, he listened. He watched. He waited. On the 4th day, Fong broke the silence. He asked Tu Hao almost casually, "What's the sentence if someone kills a person?" Tu Hao replied carefully, "It depends. If they confess, the court may show leniency." Fong nodded, then asked, "What if it's not just one?" The room went quiet. Tu Hao leaned in. "If you tell the truth, the law will listen." And just like that, the wall cracked. Over the next 6 hours, Vuong Jong Fong unraveled years of secrets. He wasn't a monk. He wasn't even religious. He was a fugitive, a runaway, a man shaped by violence, raised by a father known for beating his wife, and a mother who disappeared after an affair turned fatal.
He never finished primary school. He spent his youth stealing, hurting, disappearing. He took shelter in temples not to worship, but to hide, to pretend.
The robes were his shield. The scriptures were his costume. And for 5 years, he used them to stalk, deceive, and kill. He admitted to 7 murders and at least 19 sexual assaults, though officers suspected the true number might be higher. Each victim had one thing in common: they trusted him, because he looked like someone who couldn't hurt a soul. "I just wanted them to pay," he said at the end of his confession. For what the officer asked, Vuong Jong Fong paused. "For what the world did to me." And suddenly the silence of Tung Sun made sense.
It had been hiding a monster, dressed as a monk.
Once his confession was on record, the rest unraveled quickly. Vuong Jong Fong's past. What little had been documented painted a bleak picture. Born in Yensu, Henan province, he was the elder of two brothers in a home that was anything but safe. His father, a man feared in their village, was notorious for domestic violence and petty crime. His mother vanished after an alleged affair, leaving Fong and his brother to endure both the physical and emotional wreckage.
He never stood a chance, but as one officer noted, having a tragic childhood doesn't excuse becoming a monster.
Fong dropped out of school before finishing grade 5. He began stealing, loitering, intimidating others, mostly small-time offenses. But in 1994, he was reported by a former girlfriend for theft. That single act, being betrayed by someone he trusted, would ignite a deep and enduring hatred. According to his own words, that betrayal unlocked something dark. By 1996, Fong had disappeared into the mountainous temples of Tung Son. There, under the guise of a humble monk or a wandering herbalist, he became nearly invisible. It was the perfect cover. For 5 years, he lived in the shadows, praying by day, predating by night. He selected his victims carefully at first, young women, tourists, pilgrims. But soon the violence escalated. Schoolgirls, elderly women, anyone alone, and always the same pattern approach: deceive, assault, and silence. When the trial began in September 2001, the public was ready. The courtroom was packed. Survivors, families, journalists all waited to see the man who had turned one of China's most sacred sites into a hunting ground. Wang Zhongfeng walked in shackled, wearing a thin prison uniform. He looked around smirking. Some say he even winked at the reporters.
The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically, the confessions, the forensics, the testimonies. Each story more chilling than the last. But Fong, he didn't flinch.
At one point he laughed. When asked by the judge if he had anything to say for himself, he responded, "If I had proper training, I'd probably be better at this than your investigators." The room fell into stunned silence. Even his parents, who had refused to attend the hearings, issued a statement through a local newspaper. "We do not know this man, and we cannot stand beside his actions." Public outrage was overwhelming. In cities and towns across China, citizens lit candles for the victims. Online forums swelled with calls for justice, for reform, for answers. How could someone have killed so many for so long and walked freely among monks and worshippers? On the final day of court, the verdict was read. Guilty. 7 counts of homicide, multiple counts of aggravated assault and unlawful imprisonment. The sentence: death by firing squad. On execution day, hundreds gathered quietly outside the prison. No protests, no chaos, just silence. And when the news broke that the sentence had been carried out, the only audible sound was a single word whispered over and over by grieving families and locals alike. Finally, but for many, closure would never come. As one survivor later wrote, he took more than lives. He took peace, trust, faith. And that's the thing about monsters who wear masks. They don't just hide in the dark, they hide in plain sight. In the wake of Wang Zhongfeng's execution, a strange quiet settled over the region. For the people of Henan, especially those who lived in the shadow of Mount Tung Son, the silence wasn't comforting. It was loaded, like the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting to be trusted again. Over 5 years, a predator had disguised himself as a man of faith, hiding behind temple walls and ceremonial robes. And in doing so, he shattered not just lives, but belief systems. For many in China, the case triggered a national reckoning. How had a man like Fong moved so freely among monks and pilgrims? How had he manipulated his way into sanctuaries meant to provide spiritual refuge? And why hadn't anyone asked more questions when strangers with no credentials began living inside religious spaces? One investigator would later say, "He didn't just use the forest to hide. He used our trust, our reverence, our assumptions. And that's perhaps the most haunting part of it all. Wang Zhongfeng never needed to be invisible. He just needed to look like someone who couldn't possibly be a threat.
A man of God, a peaceful monk, a harmless hermit. But under the saffron robes and solemn face there was rage. Calculated, cold-blooded rage.
His victims were not just names on paper, they were daughters, sisters, friends. Women like Nam Tiểu Chân, who simply wanted a peaceful walk through the woods, or Lu Tin, who wandered slightly off trail and never came back, or the schoolgirls who never made it home. They weren't naive, they weren't careless. They were simply trusting.
And that trust was weaponized against them.
The public response to the case was overwhelming. Documentaries aired. Crime forums exploded with debate. Religious institutions across the country were audited. Local governments passed new regulations requiring formal identification for anyone staying in monasteries or temples long term.
But some damages couldn't be undone.
Families were left grieving without closure. Survivors bore scars no trial could erase, and the mountain itself, once a place of pilgrimage and poetry, became synonymous with something much darker. And yet, maybe that's the final paradox, because just as the mountain had hidden a killer, it had also protected the evidence needed to find him. Just as the silence had concealed crimes, it had also preserved their truth, waiting for someone brave enough to listen.
And someone did.
Canbin, the survivor who broke the pattern. Nam Truong, the officer who wouldn't give up, and the countless people who refused to let the story end in whispers.
In the end, Fong's reign ended not with a scream, but with a reckoning, a moment when masks fell, and justice, however delayed, finally arrived.
But the question still lingers even now. How many more predators still walk among us, not in shadows, but in robes? And how many people pass them each day with eyes wide open, but hearts too trusting? This has been the story of the predator of Mount Tung Sun, a case that reminds us that evil doesn't always snarl or bare its teeth. Sometimes it bows and whispers prayers,